So I grew up in Tyler. I grew up in the middle of the city on Houston Street, and we had 3 acres on Houston Street. And so my didn't grow up out in the country, didn't grow up on a farm per se, but we had gardens every year. We had fruit trees in the late 90s through the early 2000s. For years, we grew peaches and plums and apples and all kinds of figs and all kinds of fruit. So that's kind of where I got my background or my passion for organic gardening, and didn't pursue that as a career until I ended a career in as a tennis coach. And then I went into organic gardening full time, and my wife and I started a little business called Harvest Gardens in the Tyler area, and we designed and built custom gardens, or vegetable gardens and fruit orchards for different families. And we did 12 months out of the year, we did maintenance on them. So for 5 years in the field, every day my job was out in the field, checking the trees, spraying, looking for pests, checking irrigation, things like that. So my degree or my educational background is not in horticulture or in ag. That was more or less my childhood. And then, but I don't think you need to have an ag degree from A&M to be successful growing your own produce or having fun with gardening. It's really more about knowledge is important. It's super important to have a starting point. And then after that, experience, just trying it year after year is important. Something that a good friend of mine told me, I don't remember, this was a few years ago, he was maybe in his 50s. He said, even if you are a gardener and you start really young, you might have 50 or 60 seasons, springs, that you'll get to see crops grow. So when you plant a tomato, you'll get to, you'll have 60 springs or so, basically 60 tries at, or maybe 70 at growing that specific produce. So the more you can pick up from friends or from fellow gardeners or from the internet or from classes like this, I think the better, because it's one of those things that even if you've done it 30 years, you might run into things you haven't seen before. And that's just an interesting way of looking at the knowledge side of things, why it's important to pick up knowledge, because the next spring might be different and you're just trying it again. You're trying to grow produce. You're seeing what the late freeze did or the early freeze, and you're writing it out and giving it another shot. So that's the motivation to dig into education, but it's also a kind of a point to give yourself grace if you have total failure, and it's a point to not give up, because the lifespan of a fruit tree might be 15 years or so, but maybe the first 2 or 3 years they might not produce at all. So it really is a long game when you're looking at building and growing knowledge and actually receiving or harvesting fruit or vegetables off your land. It's a long game. It might take a while. You might have all the conditions right, and like last year we had snowpocalypse, and we had that's a pretty late freeze. Or was that February? Yeah. So it was February. In theory, it didn't freeze all the blossoms on peach trees and things like that, but it was devastating. All the trees are coming out of dormancy in February, especially in East Texas. They're pushing out little buds that you can start seeing new growth. And, there are variables like that that completely change up the season. And don't give up. Last year was a disaster. This year it seems like we're having a good spring, entry into spring. This weather this weekend might be our last really cold weather. So I think a lot of the fruit trees are coming out of dormancy. Hopefully we'll have a typical blossoming cycle, and then you should hopefully have some good produce this year. So I'm gonna what we're gonna do on this. we'll just talk about each kind of column at a time, just to help me. I can get all over the place like crazy. We'll just talk about one column, and y'all can ask questions. So I'll just go over each point kind of generally, and then we'll talk about planting basics, and y'all ask as many questions as you want before we go on to the next one. So however long that'll take, it might be 3 hours, it might be an hour. We'll just get into it. This I would say is more geared towards not beginner planters. It is completely applicable, but it matters for any trees, fruit trees you plant moving forward. This is applicable to things to consider. So when you're looking at just the first little bullet point is 6 to 8 hours of sun. If you're choosing a location to put a whole orchard, say you buy 16 fruit trees, you're going to group them all together and put them in one spot. You're looking at your land. I would choose an area that has really good sun. That's really gardening and growing 101 there. Just you want as much sun as you can get. So choose a location that has a lot of sun, and that's applicable even if you're planting a single fruit tree. Around your house is fine, but be conscious of what side the house is on, because you might get 4 or 5 hours of shade as the sun's coming up, then the sun will crest the roof, and then you start getting blazing sun on your trees in the afternoon. So just be conscious of that. Way out in an open field, just planting a tree out there is totally fine. That's okay. A lot of these trees out here are kind of in that environment. That's an okay place for a fruit orchard or planting a fruit tree. Full sun is okay. If it's getting sun from sun up to sundown, that's fine. The main thing here is that all trees are searching and looking and fighting for sunlight. And if you can just go ahead and get that out of the way, that competition, and plant them in a wide open spot, that's already a leg up for being successful. Really practically, the biggest thing you're going to see with really good sunshine versus not is ripening of the fruit. A lot of times, and I've seen it, a fruit tree row per se planted on kind of the side or the edge of a forest line. It's interesting because half of the fruit, say if it's a peach, will be red, the side that the sun is hitting all day, and the other half will be green. Tomatoes kind of do that too. So as much as possible, when you're orienting your rows and you're trying to give your tree sunlight, try to give it that full sun so that the fruit itself can catch some of that sun. So it's not just getting 100% shade on one side. Because the sun itself helps ripen those larger fruits and kind of gives them sunburn, and that's good for them. So next little point here I have is when you're finding a place to plant a fruit tree, I would say it's very similar to planting any type of crop. I would lean towards planting in good sandy loam soil, with good topsoil layer, and something with good drainage. In ag, drainage is often talked about, or having soil that the water can permeate through is important. If the soil structure and subsoil structures hold moisture for a long period of time, your microbial life in your soil can convert from aerobic, which is with oxygen, they breathe and eat, to anaerobic. So the microbes that live more like at the bottom of a pond environment or around a swamp. Those two, there is microbial life in both of those places, but in breathable soil that has a lot of oxygen, that's what most or all crops that I can think of grow in. You want that soil to be breathable. So you want soil that permeates, that water can pass through the soil. Straight sugar sand's fine. You can grow fruit trees in that. I would amend the soil with some type of compost, give it a little something to actually hold some moisture. But the starting place of a healthy soil is something that breathes, that isn't leaning towards anaerobic microbial life. We can get into that if you'll have any questions. That's more really complicated, but anyways, my next little blip here is planting with a purpose. I think if y'all are planting a single tree, it's less important to think about spacing and all that kind of thing. If you want to plant even a row of 3 fruit trees, say if there are peaches, just look up the growth habit. Even in the peach family, there are dwarfs, there are semi-dwarfs, and there are kind of full-size peach trees that mature at different heights. So when you're selecting trees, you don't have to look at absolutely every stat on that tree, but one of them would be how big is it going to get, and then you're going to space your fruit trees based on the tree size at maturity, not the tree size at planting. You know, all trees are going to, when you plant them, are going to be nice and small, but you kind of want to base your planting spacing at tree maturity. You're basing it on that stat. The spacing is important, and just one thing to note on that: if you want to get your best production for a small space, it is okay to crowd the trees per se and plant them closer than a recommended planting spacing. Just know that you'll have to maintain the tree more with pruning throughout the years, because it's not super unhealthy for the trees per se, but if the root systems are super close together and the entire canopies are interlocking, it's difficult to harvest. The tree isn't standing alone and it's not by itself. It's more like a hedge of trees. That's a little bit closer to more commercial agriculture. They need to get as many trees in a small amount of space to maximize that piece of land. But if you have any extra space, give that tree the proper spacing for the root system and for the canopy, just so you can walk around each tree, walk a 360 without having to duck or crawl under the limbs and things like that. It just makes it easy, and the trees themselves, I think, can stay healthier. Before we kind of get on to the next one, another kind of nerdy fact is that trees need oxygen. They need to breathe, especially for fruit production. During the spring and it stays wet, if there's so much foliage close together that air can't easily pass through the trees and the limbs, you're going to get more fungal issues and you're going to get more rotted fruit. So that's just something to consider, and that is applicable to every vegetable and tree out there, really. You just need them. You need wind and air to be able to pass through, and you need the plant to breathe. So that's something to consider on spacing. Planting depth is pretty important. These days, you know, back in the day, a lot of trees were planted by seed, and you never have to worry about planting depth. The seed will sprout and grow and do whatever it wants to. These days, 90% of the trees that we plant and cultivate are grafted trees. So the root stock is a native or a very disease-resistant root stock, and they graft on a pear tree or an apple tree onto that root stock to give it an advantage to disease. And so the main planting depth indicator on fruit trees is looking at that graft. As long as that graft is above the soil line, in general, you're okay. So 3 or 4 inches above the grafting point. The graft, and y'all will probably be able to see on a lot of these trees when we go outside, you will see a kind of a bare stub sticking out maybe 6 inches above the pot of the tree. That's the graft point. And then you'll see all the new growth on top of that the tree, the tree's healthy and tall, but down near the pot, down near the soil line, you'll see an old graft point, and that was done a year or two ago. So if that's below soil, that exposed wood can rot. It can bugs can enter. It's an entry point, and it's just a place of disease. So just keep it above ground, and you're going to be okay. The product that Ed and Rachel have here, any type of tree paint would be a good thing to put on that open graft point. You don't have to reapply it year after year after year. That's a pretty stable, the graft point's pretty stable, and it's not just ready to decay at any moment. The tree grows around that graft point, grows new bark, and it's pretty okay, but that's just something to consider as the tree's really young. I guess I talked about growth habits already. Growth habits, it's kind of in the same line of thought as tree spacing. Most peach trees, whether they're dwarf or semi-dwarf or full-sized, are going to have a similar shape and growth pattern. Other varieties of fruit trees, like pears, for instance, their growth pattern, every single little bit of growth tries to grow straight up. So you're going to see on different fruit tree varieties, our pruning techniques, we're going to have to try to manipulate the tree to grow out and widen out instead of having 6 main trunks growing 3 inches together and just having basically a little stick tree. So consider your growth habit when you're planting the tree, and if you're planting a quantity of trees, because you can, knowing, for instance, pear trees mature really tall, 20, 25, 30 feet tall sometimes, but because their growth habit is really straight up and down, you could actually plant them closer together in that sense. Peach trees or apple trees, they mature at typically below 15 feet, but you might actually want to plant them further apart because their canopy, a lot of their growth habit is out. So those are little tidbits to look into when y'all are choosing your fruit trees and deciding how close to plant them together or where to plant them. If you're planting, one thing, I dabbled in traditional landscaping. One thing y'all might see if y'all are in the Tyler area is a lot of new construction. There's magnolias and trees like that planted 3 or 4 feet away from commercial buildings, whether it's a hospital or a school. And that's just a good example of it's the wrong tree for the wrong place. The growth habit might be too wide for that spot. There are trees that you can plant 5 feet or 4 feet away from a house, but it might not be a magnolia or something like that. So kind of consider that for the long run. Y'all want to think about 3 to 5 to 10 years down the road, not the tree at planting time. And that's hard to do, but that same thought process, it applies to our pruning technique, our everything we do with the tree. We're thinking about the season coming up ahead and the tree habit and the growth habit of that tree for ahead, not just right now. So I wrote down a couple other points here. I'll try to touch on them briefly in the planting basics. I wrote down disease resistant. I wouldn't say that y'all have to worry about that too much. Mostly disease resistance has a lot to do with the root system. Almost all fruit trees nowadays are grafted onto a pretty disease resistant root stock. So the only other diseases that would be affect your fruit trees would be bark diseases and general hardiness. You know, for instance, some fruit trees thrive up north. They can grow and produce down here, but in general, if you're looking at disease resistance, it's kind of good to grow trees that are that like being local, that don't thrive in, you know, Wisconsin or something. So one little blip, and there might be a lot of questions on this, and this is probably one of the most important points in the planting basics, and that is chill hours. You want to consider chill hours when you're choosing the tree. Chill hours, pollination and cross-pollination, pairs, and then diversifying kinds of trees. So, for instance, if you just absolutely love peaches and you want to have a 50 peach tree orchard, I would plant 6 or 8 different kinds of peaches, just because they're going to be blossoming and fruiting and mature. The fruit's going to be maturing at different times of the season. You have a very high chance of actually harvesting versus planting one kind that likes to blossom at one time a year. So that's something to consider. Real quick, the meat, I kind of dove into that. The meat of this is going to be pest management and pruning, but do y'all have any questions on the kind of the planting 101, the planting basics?
Are there any like native trees around that a fruit tree doesn't grow all around? Like if you planted it close to it, or you don't have, I've got a lot of sweet gum on my property, and it's got a root system that all surfacing.
Yep.
I cut it down a lot, you know, when I bought a few trees and planted them, I cut down those around there, but it's like cedars or what have you.
Right. That's a really good question. I can't think of any. I would just say I would be conscious of root structure, competing trees. And depending on the tree, you'll see if the roots are visible, like on the sweet gums, that means they're probably a shallow root system that reaches super far. So that would be something to consider when you're planting fruit trees on location. Is you might be 45 or 50 feet away from a big old sweet gum tree, but man, that thing has been there and it's trying to suck all the nutrients out of the soil. So definitely consider that. I don't think there's any other competitiveness than water and nutrients there. So get it good and far away, or actually on that side of the tree, just cut the roots. If you're not too worried about the tree, it'll be years before the roots can make it back over to that area. But I would definitely cut the roots on that side of the tree if you don't care for it too much.
I've got so many sweet gums off.
Sweet gums are a mess. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you just briefly on chill hours discuss how to determine what's best for our? I mean, I know it's all over. You know, in our zone, there's a certain chill hour that would work, but is there other considerations that we should make with the chill hour?
The considerations, the things I would look at on chill hours is to, in general, shoot below our average. So if our average, and these stats, you can just Google it, chill hours for Tyler, and that I think at the Ag Extension it has great data on it, for like the last 20 years. But the thing I would consider is that if you choose a tree with a chill hour requirement above the average, that tree is going to come out of dormancy last in general. So if you want, for instance, we're talking about planting a huge peach orchard. If you want a high chance of those trees blossoming and not getting hit by a late freeze, I would have a lot of early, really low chill hour trees, maybe in 200 or 300, and basically when those trees hit that number, they're going to be excited and they're going to be looking to come out of dormancy and blossom. You can see like red buds and certain trees in East Texas are trying to come out of dormancy, even though we've had cooler weather. So they're going to be the first. When we have a couple spring days, they're going to be pushing out blossoms. And the longer chill hours are going to be dormant longer. They're waiting for that to go completely dormant. And so diversify your chill hours. So if we have a late freeze, your low chill hour trees will get zapped because they might have little fruit on it, on the branches already. They might have blossoms fully out. When we have that late freeze, it gets them. But the other trees are they're still dormant or not quite opening up. So that's important when you're talking about diversifying. That's really important. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
On the soil, I'm totally new at this, but we bought
Yes.
a property that had a bunch of trees, so we're trying to figure it out.
Okay.
But our property slopes, and so last spring when we had all that rain,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it washed off. So how, we live on 3 acres, I can't put topsoil on 3 acres.
Yes, ma'am.
But how much topsoil do I need, because I've got that red clay below it?
You have red clay?
Yeah.
I would disturb the clay layer beneath where you're planting at least a foot and definitely wider when you're planting that tree. Make sure that that new tree can send roots into the clay without having to disturb a layer that's been there forever and not been broken. If you can really kind of get in there and break it up, it'll have an easier time actually, because the roots will go down into clay soil. They pull a lot of nutrients out of clay soil. They'll pull a lot of moisture in the summer, really deep down in the clay. But for a young tree to just stick them in clay, it's tough on them mostly because it holds a lot of water, or it gets rock hard if we have a dry spell in the summer. So 6 to 8 inches is average. That's plenty. I would just recommend using some type of mulch, doing anything that starts building soil around that tree area. Put hay mulch out or wood chips or anything. It'll start building a deeper layer of soil that has nutrient value.
Does vermiculture help with that?
It does. Vermiculture's awesome. It's difficult to kind of keep going. I don't know a whole lot about vermiculture itself and that process, but worm castings and the more the merrier on all that kind of stuff. Any organic matter. Did somebody back? Yes, ma'am.
On trees where you've got that water runoff and the roots are starting to get exposed, I took all the leaves and raked them up over there and see if we can start composting. And
Yes, ma'am.
after I did all the work, I thought, wait, is it going to get too hot for the roots as it composts now?
That's a good question. Composting is a science. That's something to go and get a master's degree in. That's not like, or just do a lot of trial and error, and there's plenty of stuff online. It's unlikely that that leaf layer will compost and get too hot unless it has all the necessary ingredients to break down quickly. When compost has nitrogen-rich green clippings and brown leaves and things like that, the microbial life is breaking down and eating those leaves so fast that their byproducts basically increases the soil temperature up to 180 degrees. It can start itself on fire in a perfect environment. That would be a great thing to put around a tree, though. So.
Back to chill. So it's okay to plant trees that only require like 200 hours of chill? They'll just bloom earlier than the one.
In general, they'll bloom earlier. It is okay. You might, year after year, you might have them get frozen in late January or late February or March. So that's possible. So I would shoot for the midline, 500 plus, but it wouldn't be stupid to put some of those in. I like just doing a full spectrum. That's my approach. So we'll have to, let's skip around a little bit. Kind of the next one down was defense products. That's going to be the bread and butter of our talk, but let's just talk about quick equipment needed. I would, the main point on this is I would get a high quality sprayer. If you have a low pressure backpack sprayer, the stream coming out of it's going to be kind of like a water hose. It's small, but it's soaking the tree. A lot of bugs have the hardest time with whatever you're spraying with a very small particulate, just like a mist. So if you want to invest $400 or $500 and get one of the electric backpack sprayers that has high pressure, that would be a good investment. But I would shoot for something that has good pressure. One of the 1 gallon like little pump up sprayers wouldn't be optimal for a large area or for the stream that's coming out of it. That's almost more of a lot of people use it for herbicides. It just comes out like a stream, you know, so the finer the better. And so that's why I would recommend, if you're doing a lot of trees, investing in a nice backpack sprayer, or maybe a pulley behind. The higher the pressure, the better on the sprayer. Have some good quality pruners and a handsaw. You might not need them early on, especially when you're planting these trees, but later on, pruning can be a lot, and the better quality they are, the less your hand will get worn out, and the less jagged your cuts are on the limbs. If they're jagged and ripped, it's not optimal. So I would get a good pair of pruners. I really like the Still brand. They just are sharp. Felco or Swiss made, those are really good as well. Plus a good pair of pruners lasts a really long time, so they're kind of an heirloom item. You'll just have them around. And tree paint's a good thing to have on any. I will definitely preface saying tree paint is kind of above and beyond. If you really are caring for your trees and you really love them, give them some paint. Naturally, a tree, it'll take a long time. When you cut the limb or prune, it'll dry out, and then over time there will be bark that grows around and encapsulate the cut. That's normal, but if you paint it, it is a first line of defense for pests getting in there. There's boreworms, there's fungal issues. On pears is a good variety. Pears are really susceptible to blight. You know, they'll lose whole limbs and things like that to blights. And so that would be a good instance where you want to use some paint. It's going to help those airborne diseases that can get in the tree. It'll help seal that off for them. Do y'all have any questions on equipment? It's kind of
Tree paint is some special paint. It's not just any old paint.
It's kind of a special paint. Yeah, and some of it's black in like a spray can. There's quite a few brands, but it's a good thing to have around. I would say the rule of thumb, if your cut is larger than one of your fingers, then it would be beneficial to help that tree protect that wound. And this will be more going into the pruning when we go outside, but if you're having to make a really big cut on a limb that's 2 or 3 inches in diameter, it's kind of an indicator that you might have let that limb, you might have neglected pruning for 2 or 3 years, or, you know, that tree put a lot of resources and energy making that limb, and then we decided 3 years later that it wasn't a good limb for some reason. It's growing in the wrong direction, or it has a weird habit. So that's kind of why we prune yearly and think about that, to prune it up along the way. So we're making small cuts on little suckers at the time that'll turn into big limbs a year or two down the road.
One thing I wanted to mention too is if you are going to cut off a large limb, if anybody's pruned any type of tree, whether it's a fruit tree or a shade tree or ornamental tree, if it's a large limb, 2 to 3 inches thick, and you start cutting it, as the weight of that limb starts to fall, oftentimes it's going to pull part of the underside of the remaining branch with it, and now you're going to have a real ugly cut. So what I will generally do is I'll go ahead and make a small cut from the bottom first, go out from there, make my cut, and that way if it starts to tear here, it'll end where that cut is that I want to make anyway. And then you can just go ahead and cut the rest of the branch off. So just a word of warning if you're going to be doing large branches.
That's a really good point. A cut wound on a tree is not a big deal for it, If you, in the armpit of a cut, say if we cut a limb, and it breaks down like that, and it peels 4 or 5 inches of bark with it. I don't know if y'all have ever done that. It happens. That huge gash, that's a huge entry point for disease. That's going to cause a problem. So that's where paint would really be important. I'm going to jump to irrigation before we head down to or go to defensive products or defense products. Just really lightly touch on this. Most trees in East Texas, or almost all of them, are not irrigated. Like, they're just growing. And the, you know, but fruit trees are a little bit different in the sense that a long drought period in the summer, you're going to have a nice ripe fruit that's filled with moisture, and it's going to be really hard for that tree to sustain a lot of fruit if you aren't giving it supplemental water. So a rule of thumb on irrigation and on orchards, on almost all the fruit tree varieties, is the first two years or so, it's kind of getting established, and that is really important that when you plant in the winter, that you irrigate it through the spring and summer, the hottest months. In the winter time, you do not have to irrigate even a newly planted tree. Water it in a few hard times, but then let the tree just sit. We typically get enough water in the winter. If you planted a tree in November or December per se, water it once or twice that week, but the next time you might really need to water it is around this time of year when it's getting hot outside and when it's getting dry. It's the long spells that we're not introducing moisture to the soil that really hurt the tree. So 10 days or 2 weeks is a long time for a brand new tree that has a tiny little root system in the shape of a pot to pull enough moisture out of that area. Now, when it's bigger, it has a large root system, and that's not a big deal. But 1 or 2 years is a good rule of thumb. Like, that's a must. Later down the road, it more depends on the year, but I would say June, July, and August are, if you have a bunch of fruit trees and you want to harvest, I would put irrigation on your trees or hand water or something. I just did some pros and cons. If you water by hand, that's okay. You know exactly how wet you got it. It's precise, but it's really time consuming if you have more than 5 or 10 trees. Overhead irrigation is cheap and easy to install. You drag a water hose out there and you put a head on and you get everything wet. It's if you water 2 or 3 times a week and it rains periodically, imagine your area is getting wet every other day on average or so, and you can think about that as more of like a rainforest environment. That's not normal for anything around here. It would be in a rainforest where it's getting rained on often, but the tree and the soil being able to kind of dry out and breathe between showers or between irrigation is important. We don't really want a constant level of moisture in the soil because that's where we can start going anaerobic. You can let the soil dry out a little bit and it's looking a little dry, and then we can water it. So that's just some rough thoughts on that. Just kind of think about nature and think about how all these other trees are thriving and going crazy. They get very wet infrequently, and they do okay with that. So we might go weeks or months without rain, but it rains really good, and the soil gets really wet and deep, and then I would water excessively but infrequently versus, hey, let's water them a little bit each day and maybe we can keep this tree going. So that's kind of my approach on irrigation in general in an orchard setting. If it's in a pot or something, it's completely different. But drip irrigation, I've had pretty good luck with that because it can be higher maintenance. Well, I have lower maintenance on here. It's a little harder to install. You're kind of running pipes and things like that underground, and then you're popping up and putting in a drip tubing around the tree. Those can do pretty well. They save a lot of water. They're super efficient, drip irrigation, just it's not spraying in the air, it's not watering over there and over here, it's just watering the root system. It's a good product, any type of drip system. For fruit trees, do y'all have any irrigation questions? That would be handy. Yes, sir.
Ours, we water the roots directly
Okay.
with our irrigation. Would you think that would be better, or you think watering the top surface so those roots can branch out better would be better?
Are you saying you're watering the roots as in you water right at the trunk?
No, I water below the soil.
Okay, how do you do that?
We use the drip irrigation systems, but we
Okay.
go ahead and we fill the hole, because we have clay.
Okay.
So we do like a 3-foot wide hole, and then 2 feet deep or so, and we'll layer it with rock and stuff, so it doesn't do the bowl effect.
Sure.
But before we place our tree in there, we actually do our drip line, and we put the drip line in there first, and then the tree.
Okay.
So that way, it's not evaporating off the top of the soil.
For sure. I personally have never done that. In theory, I think that would be a really good system. It's probably doing a really good job.
That does well, except for when we get a lot of rain. Because then we got clay pots, basically, in the soil. And that's the only downfall. But that's because we have clay soil. We don't.
Do you have any slope?
No, we're on a hill. We are the hill.
So is it flat or is it sloped a little?
It's barely sloped.
Okay. And if I run the really heavy clay on a slope, I don't know. I made up this theory. I try to put a kind of a drainage channel in the bottom of that bowl. So if you have a slope like this and the tree's planted like this in the slope on the downside, I'll try to dig a little tunnel or a little trench so the water can kind of escape. But that's kind of in bad. That would be classified as pretty poor soil.
Well, I know. That's why I'm trying to make it work.
Which is good, and you'll probably have decent success. I would just think that the more organic matter you can put around those trees, probably the better.
Bring organic matter out there as much as we can.
Yeah, and it'll keep building up that layer, and that's always beneficial.
We started with 2 inches. I think we're about 4 or 5 now. So
That is excellent. Anything you can stick on it. Yes, ma'am.
What's the best way to water a tree
Is it on a patio per se, or is it out? Okay, I would probably by hand. Honestly, I know it can. It's very.
frequency because
Oh, okay.
it's all its leaves.
Oh, okay. Is it losing its leaves right now? I think that's normal. I believe springtime they're pushing out the old leaves, and they're gonna probably put out new foliage or blossom pretty soon. Might be wrong on that.
Blossoming, yeah.
Okay. I think that's pretty normal. In general, citrus, they have a lot of fungal issues, unless it's outside. If you have it on your patio or something, I would say pretty infrequently, maybe once every 10 days or 2 weeks. Just soak it really good, and then let it go. I don't think you need to water it every other day or something. I really don't. So you can kind of. My dad grows a bunch of lemons, and he kind of treats it like a house plant. He forgets it for weeks, and then he waters it, and then it does really, really well. I mean, hundreds of lemons on this tree in our house in the winter, and then take it out. I mean, it's a mess, but yeah. So maybe every 10 days average.
So maybe it needs fungicide.
Maybe so. I would think long term, if you water it infrequently, you might not have any fungal issues. If you have it in a window like this ficus tree, and it's getting plenty of sun, and you're not watering it excessively, it should be pretty fine. It should be good. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
When you're doing a drip irrigation, is it better to water it at the trunk of the tree or have it out?
That's a great question. Do y'all hear what she asked? Is it better to water the trunk or water the root system? Definitely watering the root system, the projected root system. So, and in the future, that's 3-4 feet out on average, or roughly the canopy width of the tree. Early on, though, and we talked about that 1 to 2 year window, you kind of need to water right where the roots are, which is as wide as the pot is when you buy a tree.
That's how it was set up, from 3 years old, or from 2 to 3 years old until they were planted. That's how we set up the thing. It goes right there at the root, but now that they're older, you're saying we need to do like a tube.
You can. Do you have drip?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have drip. I would just widen it once. Maybe the first 2 years, water at the tree, water infrequently so that water goes deep, and then once the tree's a couple years old, move it out.
You move it out, you need to add a nozzle. Because we have one nozzle. If you move it out, it's just going to be on the sides, or it's okay, or...
So you have more of a bubbler? So,
yeah, yes. Well, no, it just sprays,
oh, okay.
It's only about yay tall and just does like a little,
Okay.
but could we make a tube thing around it?
I would recommend actually getting drip tube, and I can recommend some products for you in that sense, so you can make that circle. Versus, you're right, having a nice having a bubbler or a nice wet patch on one side of the tree might not be optimal. So, short term, if y'all don't want to do an irrigation overhaul this year, just water the base. But if you want to get into, okay, let's revise our system. The trees are getting older. Then I would do a ring, so it's pretty uniform out around the tree. So, okay, that's kind of touching base on irrigation. I hope I'm not keeping y'all too long. Now we're actually getting into what y'all came for. So I'm going to be generalized on this because it's really complicated. This is going to come from more experience than anything. If you don't use any pesticides at all, you will probably get some harvest. Or you'll get a harvest with holes in the fruit and you eat around it. So it's not the end of the world if you don't use any pesticides, but if you want fruit that resembles anything that you buy in the store, you kind of need to spray. And I sprayed all organics. I don't die on that hill, but if you think about toxic chemicals and ingesting it, basically anything, any fruit in the store during its ripening cycle, it was toxic enough that nothing that tried to eat it or was around lived. No life, basically. And so, yeah, you can wash it and you can and rinse it, and it's probably not going to kill you or give you cancer. But in general, if you think about it, if you have an untouched fruit, that fruit was toxic to all life forms that would threaten that fruit looking bad, whether it's a tomato or a peach, until a ripening season, until they harvested. That is not my experience with any type of gardening or organics. You have little blemishes on the tomatoes and cucumbers or whatever it is and peaches, and they taste just as good and it doesn't matter too much, and they're always smaller than the store-bought ones. They're not as uniform. They're just kind of how you get them, and they're fine. It's always cool picking your own fruit off your own, off your own trees. So, all that to say, so this, digging into how to get bugs and pests off your trees and pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, I would say with organics, it's a lot more defensive than offensive in the sense that, and I might be switching that up, essentially non-organic pesticides are a lot of times systemic. So they have a toxic enough pesticide that they can water or spray the tree or water it in the roots and it takes it up. And when the bug is around that fruit or that plant and eating it, it dies from that. Organics nothing is systemic. Nothing, the tree isn't taking those pesticides up. It's all foliar, it's all spraying externally. So I think about that. So all that to say, another big point on organics is organic pesticides have a very, in general, a shorter life of effectiveness. So you can spray, and it's going to be toxic to the bugs, but for a much shorter time than non-organic pesticides.
So let's say you're using neem oil. How often would you apply that?
I would say every 14 days or so. And that would be, and so you can get, that's the thing. I mean, even if this is even if gardening is our passion, you've got to be pretty realistic. Sprays can get expensive. You're spraying constantly, and it's time consuming, especially when your trees mature, to spray these really tall, big peach trees. And so just realistically, every 10 to 14 days is the rough spray pattern in the most important part, which is while the fruit's ripening. Yeah, so that's just the major difference between organic pesticides and non-organic. Is the non-organic is going to have a really long life. It's going to last 2 or 3 weeks, and it's going to be super toxic, and then they'll come back and spray again. And quite a few of those are systemic. And non-organics is all external, and it has a shorter life. So in theory, you need to spray a lot more often. You probably do, but you have to be realistic with spray intervals. You can't get out there every night and spray your trees. So just going to run through these on the defense products. We got fungicides or fungicides. These fungicides are really important. In my, I'm not an expert on fungicides, but they're really important around the blossoming season, in the sense that it's very similar to tomato end rot. That's happening when it blossoms. There's so much moisture and rot and decay in the blossom itself that when it pushes out a tomato, into that tomatoes from early on rots off. So it's kind of think about that as a fungal issue, similar to, it's very similar in fruit trees. Peaches per se, or apples, will get these big spots on them from a fungal, when they're blossoming, having a lot of fungal problems. So it's not something you got to spray year round or all the time. Fungicides are really when you're getting around right before blossoming, and maybe right after, you want to spray some fungicides. Fungicides work by changing the pH. Copper, liquid copper is an organic. It makes the environment more acidic, and fungus grows in its specific pH that it likes, and it doesn't really thrive in acidity or really alkaline environments. So what you're doing when you're spraying fungicides in general is you're changing the pH. That kills all the funguses and bacteria, and then eventually with rain and just the natural environment, the pH will come back to normal, whatever the normal air and the branches pH rests at, probably around base. So copper would make it acidic. That would be an effective fungicide. And then sodium bicarbonate is another fungicide. That's basically baking soda. You can get an agriculture baking soda called sodium bicarbonate, and it makes it more alkaline. So when you mix up a spray and you spray it on your fruit trees around blossoming season, it changes the pH and makes it more alkaline and kills the fungus. And those will be residual for a while, basically until it rains. Do y'all have any more questions about fungicides before we move on? These are more detailed here. Okay, so the typical reason of fungicides is to kill the fungus during and right after blossoming. When your fruit trees are pushing out the blossoms, that's when they're right about to set that fruit.
Once they blossom, don't spray.
I would spray them one more time at least with fungicide after it's blossomed and the blossoms have dropped. And I'm just mostly going to walk through the different sprays, and then we'll kind of go into the schedule at the very bottom, the order of operations. Okay, then there's pesticides, which are kind of like neem oil. It's an oil that's kind of toxic to bugs. I don't know what a neem is. I've done research on it different times. I just keep forgetting. There's dormant oil, which is typically vegetable oil of some types. Dormant oils are an effective pesticide year-round, but I would say you could use them year-round. It's going to be effective for the bugs, but it can hurt the foliage of the tree in the summer. If you're spraying an oil on a leaf, it's burning and it's hurting. The leaf breathes. It photosynthesizes, so it needs oxygen. You coat it with oil. Oil's everywhere. It's not good. So I would do that when the tree's dormant. In the winter months, spray dormant oil 2 or 3 times. Before, in February, early March, spray dormant oil. Those will help get rid of your scales, all the bugs have a reproductive cycle. The bugs don't just crawl out of nothing. So there's eggs around, there's larvae, there's stuff. I don't know how it's, hangs in there from a year prior, but it does. And so it really helps. The typical way the oils work on bugs is it suffocates them. It's not, sometimes they ingest it and they can hurt the bugs, but because we're kind of talking about organics, we're talking about really base ways of how to kill something. And this is suffocation. That's how we're killing these bugs, is we're spraying oil very finely mixed with water in their environment, and it suffocates them, okay? Pyrethrins. Yes? You could. Yep. Before blossoming.
Like we got buds just starting to burst, it's okay to go ahead and spray dormant oil even though they're just fixing it.
I don't think it would hurt it.
Okay.
Yeah. Pyrethrins are organic in the sense that they come from chrysanthemum flowers or whatever those are. They're organic, but they're pretty toxic. So pyrethrin, you might want to underline that, is the most powerful organic pesticide. If you have an issue, that will take care of it, but it has a short effective life. When you spray it, it'll kill whatever's there. But 6 hours later, something lands on it, it's not just going to fall over dead. And that's most organics. Non-organics, it'll be as toxic as all get out, and it lands and it's there and it'll eat it and it just dies. Even our most powerful organic pesticides are not like that in general. So pyrethrin are extremely effective if you have any type of infestation or if you just want to hit it with it. A really good brand, if you want to write it down, that I've found, it's expensive, but it's really good. It's called Pyganic. P-Y, Pyganic. Then there's spinosad and Bacillus thuringiensis. Both of those are more biological for the bug. Those are both bacterias, and the byproduct of the bacterias kills the reproductive system of the bugs. It makes them sick. It kills them. Those are a lot more, those stay around longer. Basically, I would say between 10 and 14 days, those will still be working on the trees. The spinosad and the Bacillus thuringiensis. Those are both biological ways of.
So we use BT for like trying to keep squash bugs off,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. What are they killing on the trees?
BT mostly targets soft caterpillar type bugs. So really hard shell stuff, not as much, but it can be effective. It mostly affects the reproductive system and the larva. It's like, it's a bad bacteria. It's found in the soil. It's everywhere, but in those high concentrations, they can't handle it. So I think Spinosad does the same thing basically, but it's coming from a different angle. And then Red Ryder BB gun. If you have squirrels and stuff like that, I would just say that don't be afraid to shoot them, because I've tried nets and things like that, and on a mature tree, it's so difficult to get coverage all the way around the tree to protect your fruit. It's kind of weird. I've heard a lot of people ask, like, hey, birds just tear up my peaches and peck a bunch of holes. I haven't seen a lot of that. It's kind of weird. I did when I was a kid. I don't now. I mean, maybe there are less woodpeckers or something, or less blue jays, but they would come in and peck 2 holes, and then the whole peach rots out. It does happen, but I would say if you have 10 peach trees, that's going to be part of the process of organic gardening, that you're going to lose a percentage of your fruit to a couple pecks here and there. If you have squirrels, I would probably shoot them, because they can knock out a massive amount of fruit.
Feed the birds on the other side of the house.
What's that?
Feed the birds on the other side of the house.
Keep your birds fed on the other side of the house. That's a really good point. So those are just talking about a lot of the things that threaten the tree itself, but also the fruit. There aren't that many things that threaten the tree health, the tree trunk and the tree itself. There are scales, there are boreworms that get inside it. Those are a problem. But in general, a tree wants to grow, and it's pretty resistant to those things. Most of these we're talking about are effective to trying to preserve the fruit so we can harvest. That's the whole goal of all of this. It's fun and it's good, but we want to be able to reap, something. All of these pesticides, everything in the pesticide category, I mix up cocktails of all kinds of stuff and spray a lot of things, because it doesn't hurt to it's not super toxic, it's not, super crazy, so it doesn't hurt to just hit it from every angle. One last little note on these products: they can kill pollinators. So in general, pollinators are really important for pollination in blossoming season. Even if it's a self-pollinating tree, you want bees running around. So I would just say spray in the early morning. I prefer in the late afternoon, but most of these products, once they dry, aren't going to kill a bee. Pyrethrin, if it's wet, will kill a bee. Spinosad, if it's still soaking wet and he lands and floods in a puddle of it, he'll die. But these are all pretty safe for pollinator, which is super important. What's that?
After they dry.
After they dry.
So like I've got bees, so I could just close up the hive at night and then spray the next day and then let them out the next day.
Exactly. Yep, and early morning is a good time. I prefer late afternoon or in the evening. If you want to mix it up during the day.
And then like 100 degrees, you still spray it in the evening?
I'd spray in the evening. As long as it's not just direct sun beating down on it, I would spray when it's hot, versus if you spray in the morning, it might be 9 o'clock in the morning or so before it dries out, and kind of, I don't know. Probably either way is okay. So
When you say late in the evening, is that like around 4 o'clock?
I would say if you are really conscious about pollinators, you don't want to kill any bees like at dark, when it's getting dark outside.
6:30.
Yeah, that's going to be your least chance.
Morning or 8, isn't it? Around here, summertime's morning or 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the summer. So I know that can be a pain. Maybe do some things around the yard and mix up your spray during the day and then hit them at night. But this isn't like all the time you're having to be out there every night, Yes, ma'am?
I have this may be a silly question.
Yeah.
What's the best way to
get to the top of a mature tree when you're spraying?
Yeah.
What's a good hint there?
There are A ladders are pretty good, but there are ladders called orchard ladders as well that have a normal A ladder side, but then it has a pole on the other. Those are pretty effective, but that's kind of part of it as well. A few things can affect that. One, your pruning habits. You could start bringing that tree way down in the future and make it accessible for you. And the second thing is also invest in a good sprayer that you can at least get up 5 or 6 feet would be probably maximum from your wand height. So I don't have any thoughts besides that on spraying kind of the top of the canopy. But coverage is just not going to be quite as good up there. It's way,
Yeah, I figure you get the bottom.
especially on like pear trees. Pear trees will be 30 feet tall. And you just, well. So, yes, ma'am.
Every single year, one of my biggest problems are the leaf-legged bugs.
Yes.
Do they cause a lot of damage to fruit trees, and what would you use on them?
I think they cause a lot of, I think they can eat the fruit. I think they're more interested in the fruit, but pyrethrin would be a good one for them. It will, but you need to get it on them, spray them.
What is your cocktail?
Everything, everything on the list, on the pesticide.
All in the same sprayer?
Yep, and it's of course just 1 ounce of this and 2 ounces of that, but whatever's kind of recommended on the bottle. But I'll do everything at once. I wouldn't do a lot of the oils in there. If I wouldn't do neem and dormant oil. I just, if it's too oily, they don't separate very well anyways. So, any questions about these sprays that help kill bugs? Okay. All right, so real quick, let's talk about order of operations. In the winter months, this would just be real general. In the winter months, I would spray dormant oil 3 times maximum. Maybe spray once a month just to help the tree out. And dormant oil is mixed with water. You're not just spraying straight oil on it. So, something to think about. Dormant oils come in a huge variety of qualities. The thinner the oil, the better. There are some brands. There's one called Pure Spray. It looks like as thin as water. You can barely tell the difference. And it emulsifies in the water really well, and it sprays super well. If you get a really thick, like neem oil, for instance, is like globby almost. It's super thick, especially when it's cold outside in the winter. You're mixing up your sprayer and it's freezing outside, and it gets so thick, it's coming out of the end of the wand, even though it's cut with water, just really poorly. You want it to spritz or whatever kind of. You want it to mist. Yeah.
Does witch hazel help with that? I use essential oils too. You can put witch hazel with our essential oils and it helps disperse the oil.
Does it help emulsify it? I don't know. There are products that you can put in there to help blend them, and I'm not super familiar off the top of my head with names of those, but anything that is emulsifier is really helpful. So, anyways, so winter months, pre-bloom is before petal drop. These aren't laid out in kind of a clockwise. So winter months, straight below that is pre-bloom. So when you start seeing larger buds on the end of the fruit trees and the twigs and everything, I would count that as pre-bloom. You might even see a couple blooms here and there.
Like that, like a hydrant.
Yeah, so this would be a good example of pre-bloom. Is it took all winter for these trees to make these little guys, okay? Every one of these is probably not going to be a flower. Some of these are going to be leaves mostly, but there'll be some flowers mixed in on these. So that's a good example. I don't know if all of you guys can see those bumps. That's a good, this is pre-bloom still. Spray your dormant oils because it's getting warmer. Those bugs are waking up and getting excited. And your fungicides. So that's when you want to start your fungicides. I would probably spray your dormant oil 3 times in the winter. Maybe call that December, January, and February. And when March rolls around, like say right now, it's a good time. Then let's just treat this as pre-bloom, the pre-bloom month. So spray a fungicide in March. Spray liquid copper with your spray or a bunch of sodium bicarbonate. Change the pH of those leaves so it can kill the funguses. And spray your dormant oil one last time, okay? And then it's when they flower out, everything's in full flower, spray a fungicide. So you're killing that fungus. Yes, sir.
Do any of these fungicides need any kind of surfactant or anything to make them stick, or you just spray them on and forget them?
I'm really not sure if surfactants are organic or not organic. I think it's just a product that helps it stick. So if it probably wouldn't hurt mixing some surfactant in there. I can't remember the last time I bought a surfactant, so I wouldn't know where to get it. Maybe I don't know. But it probably wouldn't hurt to help it stick on there and stay for a little while. So that's when the petals are all the way open, just let them do their thing. Let them blossom. When they drop, they're going to have tiny little fruits right behind it if the blossom was pollinated. And that's what you want to spray. When the petals are kind of snowing off the tree and coming off, spray fungicide one more time. So that's a total of twice, really. Pre-bloom, let the tree go through its cycle, pollinate, blossom, all that, and then when the petals start dropping off, spray that fungicide one more time. Yes, ma'am.
I sprayed mine with the dormant oil and the copper mixture.
Yes.
And then it rained. Should I reapply?
I would. Okay. Yep. Rain is, yeah, look at the forecast. It can kind of mess up your thing. If it's within 24 hours, maybe do it again. But if it's like 3 or 4 days later, then
No, it was literally 24 hours later. It's like, hello, here I am.
Oh, man. Yeah. So that's good. Sounds like you're on schedule. And then once all your petals are dropped and you've got little fruits, then it's this super long cycle of like that fruit is becoming sugar content's going up and up and up from conception all the way until you harvest. So it's basically getting more and more tasty for bugs. In general, though, if the fruit is untouched in the first 3 or 4 weeks, in general, it's good. If you're not going to have a beautiful big peach and then a worm jumps in it. It just doesn't really happen. It typically happens like really early on. I don't know if a fly comes around and lands, but it'll get in that fruit, and then you have a nice little green plum or a green peach, and it has that pinhole. That happened when that fruit was the size of a pea or smaller. That happened really early on. So I would say the most important pesticides that we've done are fungicides. We've sprayed to keep the fruit from rotting from funguses, but now we're shifting focus to the pesticides. The most important window is, I would say, the 4 weeks after petal drop. I think that's the most important window. Get out there twice, maybe 3 times if you want to go heavy on this cocktail of organic pesticides. If you want to go more often, it is not going to hurt it because these are not, they don't have the shelf life. It isn't toxic for 3 weeks, and you better wear a mask if you go in there. It's just not. So
And you said how often?
I would say 14-day intervals max. 10 to 14 days is, you could go every week if you wanted. You could. Right after petal drop.
Okay.
After that, all the blossoms drop off, that next 4 weeks is pretty crucial.
So you're gonna hit it 2, maybe even 3 times
Mm-hmm.
with the pesticides after that.
Yes, sir. Hit it with everything. You can probably hit it with some Dormant Oil. It's not going to hurt the fruit. It's not going to hurt the bark. You know, one thing to note, there's going to be a lot of other bugs around the trees that are eating the foliage. There's a condition on peach trees called hole shot, where the leaves are almost all the leaves are just, they look like it got shot with a shotgun. They're full of holes. In general, I used to really be scared of foliage damage. That is a sign that you have a lot of bugs eating stuff. In general, though, your tree can take a lot of foliage damage, and they're just going to drop the leaves in the fall. So a little foliage damage and little holes here and there, and hey, this one leaf is turning, general is okay, because those leaves are only going to be on the tree for a few months. And if in general all the foliage is looking decent, it's doing their job for the tree. So if you have bad looking foliage, it is a sign that bugs are around, but it doesn't mean that your whole tree is unhealthy or getting eaten up and it's about to die. Those leaves have some nutritional value, so bugs are coming in there and eating the leaves too. And every other leaf out there that, you know, is brand new, it's got new cells and bugs are eating on them. That's way less of a priority than the actual little fruits that we're trying to take care of. So don't worry too much about foliage damage. When the leaves, you see holes in them or bite marks, those type of caterpillars aren't eating the baby fruits typically. So I've gotten a little bit more chill on the leaves. I'm like, it's going to drop in November or December and then pop out new ones, so it's okay. So it is a sign though, so just watch them. Any more thoughts before we go outside and do some pruning? Yes.
I am new to Texas.
Okay.
I have a question about the Red Ryder BB gun.
Yes.
What Texas birds are not to be shot?
Oh, mockingbirds are state bird. That's the only one that I think you can get in trouble for. Squirrels, I think you should get around.
You have to check on your county what the honey says.
I've shot the squirrels out of season. That's true. There are exemptions to crop damage. I think you can even shoot crows if you have to. But that's, yeah. Okay, do y'all have any more questions? All right. Before we go outside, I'll just have a twig here. I'll have somebody carry it out for me if that's okay. I did a bunch of pruning this morning for the Donnellys, and this is just an example. I'll show y'all. The trees we're about to look at aren't mature. They're not huge, so it's going to be difficult to give you like the full tour. But this is an example of about a 4-year-old peach tree, and this is one limb of thousands. And so I brought this one inside mainly for the reason that it has a lot of redundant limbs. So when you're thinking about pruning now, in general, if we're thinking 1 or 2 years ahead, right? So if you think about each one of these limbs doubling caliper, so getting bigger around, and this trunk getting bigger around, you start seeing like this isn't a problem, but in the future you're going to have 5 branches that are 1.5 inches in diameter around going in the exact same direction, and that's just totally redundant. It's unnecessary. It's crowded. So this is one of the things we'll look at and talk about when we're outside. But this is where I'll prune and leave at least every other one and leave space so every branch kind of has a purpose. So we'll take this outside and we can get into the pruning. we're gonna talk real quick. So unfortunately, this isn't a huge fruit tree that's a disaster or that is neglected or anything like this. This is, I think, been in the ground at least a year, but it already needs a tiny bit of pruning, really not a whole lot. Pruning is pretty, it's very important, but the main reasons for pruning are gonna be for tree strength and structure, holding fruit. So really little branches like this, if they blossom and set fruit, just one, this is an apple, one apple's gonna be tough on it. It's impressive how strong these get over time as the apple grows. The limb, I think, must strengthen as the fruit gets bigger, because I've seen it bent all the way to the ground. It's not broken, but if I just did this, it might pop. But all that to say, we're pruning for structural integrity on the limbs. We're pruning for, ease of use, getting around the tree and doing things in it, and we're pruning for shape, making it look nice. I'm sure there are other reasons that'll pop into my head, but in general, trees blossom, and if a tree blossoms, it can't set a fruit without blossoming. So in general, trees blossom and set fruit on new growth. So you see, this is a really good example in the very end, and y'all can come closer if you want. This branch is a year or two of growth. This probably wasn't 1 year of growth pushing out. So there's sections you can see that different colors, like this is a darker brown, is 1 year of growth. A lot of times fruit trees won't set fruit on old growth. For instance, you'd never see a blossom pop out of right here, because that's 2 or 3 years old, but it's pushing on new growth. So pruning kind of manipulates where we need new growth, and if you don't want fruit set to happen way out here, we can bring that fruit set closer in to the tree, and pruning also encourages new growth. So in general, pruning a single limb makes the limb want to split into 2 in general. Sometimes it splits into 5. It increases your bearable branches, really. So this has a few main limbs here, and if we pruned, it's going to want to shoot out buds and split and multiply the limbs. So that can be a blessing, but it can kind of be a curse if it gets, if we cut some of these, it can turn into 5 or 6. And so every year I'm kind of consolidating, instead of having an end with 5 little branches going in 5 different directions, I'll bring it back down to 2. So this is an example of, like, this has 3 or 4 branches, and if we're thinking 1 or 2 years in the future, these branches are going to be this much longer, and they're going to be double the caliper, and this branch isn't going to stay tiny, it's going to get longer. So you think these are 5 branches on the end of a long deal. And so at the very minimum, just very conservative cut would be to at least cut 1 of them. So we have, instead of 3, or 4, we have at least 3 different directions here. On a younger tree, you can be a little bit more aggressive in pruning. And so it's more like it's just a term I use, but this tree is getting pretty leggy, in the sense that this branch doesn't have a lot of splits in it. It's just going really high. So, we can talk about that in a second, but I'm gonna real quick talk about the 2 main tree shapes and styles, or pruning methods. One is the central leader, which this is a different variety. This is of tree. This is a pear. This is an apple, but there's only 2 or 3 different ways to train a tree anyways. So it really doesn't matter what kind of tree it is. There's central leader, where it has a main trunk, and you have a traditional, like any normal tree that's not pruned, it has branches coming off the main trunk. And this main trunk is going to keep getting taller, and you're going to have more and more limbs. In general, for home gardening, I rarely let trees go by themselves in this configuration, because this is only a 1.5 or 2 year old tree, and it's already getting out of reach. And so this has something to do with pears wanting to, we've talked about pears only wanting to grow up. So these branches is probably this year will turn, and then they grow straight up. So we, in general, when I'm pruning and encouraging these young trees to go in the direction I want, I'm encouraging the horizontal growth. So all that to say, so these are our 2 main tree pruning styles or tree shapes. We got central leader. This is the central leader just continuing up. You have branching coming off of it. Then you have, some people call it a vase, but I like calling it a wine glass. You have a low and open centered tree, which is much more conducive for a home orchard or garden. It's not a disadvantage. One factor on a wine glass tree is that it's going to be as wide about as it is tall. So you have to consider that when you're spacing the tree. This one, just by nature, if you're going to plant a big long row down your driveway of pears and you just want them to get tall and big and beautiful, you could probably plant a lot closer together, because these branches naturally don't grow out that much. It just wants to go up. So so this is a wine cup, wine glass shape, and this tree is kind of this style because it was manipulated early on. This tree was pruned and shaped from early on. Real quick, so this is the graft point we were talking about earlier. Every tree is going to have one. On this tree, it's not barely visible, but it's right here. This is the graft point right here. As long as that's above the ground, we're fine. But probably when this tree was half the caliper size, maybe about this big, one of the employees here, or probably me back in the day, cut it off completely, just a stick. And when you cut a young tree down like that, you would think it would just kill it, but guess what it wanted to do? So this was that point that it was just cut off. We had the root, you had the graft point, and it was probably a nice whip. They're called whips when they're young trees. And if you cut it off completely, in the next couple years, the buds, these little bumps coming down the tree, because it was cut and it's trying to survive, it has to photosynthesize, it has to push out leaves. So it's going to encourage horizontal branching to pop out of the buds below the cut. So this is a pruning technique. You don't have to do it. It just is one of the ways you can control your tree and make it manageable, so you don't have to climb a ladder to pick something, or something like that. So this tree isn't naturally growing like this, in the sense that it just has this perfect little split right here and they're all going out. This was taken care of, and this is something to consider when you're buying fruit trees. If you want it to have a wine cup shape, buy something like this, and it's gonna hurt, but just cut it off the first year in the winter. Just cut it off about hip to shoulder level. And you're gonna think, oh man, that's gonna take all potential away for harvesting next year. Well, you don't really want to harvest or try to expect a harvest off the a 1-year-old tree anyway. So just think 1 or 2 years down the road. It's a long game. So the other considerations when we're pruning is so shape. We talked about wine cup, kind of how to start that shape, and there are central leader. So decide on what shape you want to go with the tree, and then the other points that follow are really easy. You want to cut off dead always. You want to prune in the winter when things are dormant. There's not a ton of sap flowing through the branches. Pruning in the winter is a must, unless you want to remove a limb that's cracked or broken or is a problem. Then you can remove that in the spring or summer. But so you can prune off dead always. That's always an easy given. You want to prune off branches that grow in towards the trunk. So a lot of these little spurs right here, like this one, for instance, if you imagine 1 year of growth, that could be a foot or 2 feet tall. So this little guy right here isn't going to be a problem, but if that's growing into the main trunk and crisscrossing it, I would cut it off. We had this little stick right here. This is another example of, this was a peach tree. A lot of trees will kind of want to do this. This is a good example right here. All 3 of these are growing in the same direction. They're filling the same space, filling the space of the circumference of the tree. And you think about each one of these growing up, becoming a big mature tree and doubling and tripling caliper. You're going to have 3 branches plus going in the same direction. It's just redundant. It's too many. So there's very few cuts that I actually need to make on this tree. It's pretty healthy. It looks good. But for a starting point, I would say a minimum is just trimming off a couple of these. And if there's a big open space right here, and this guy has a chance to maybe get through and fill out an open area of the tree, then maybe we can hope that this branch will do it. But we don't need 3 doing that. Does that make sense?
So what about this one?
That little guy, he's okay. He might become a problem. This happens pretty often where lower branches down here, you imagine these growing up to be quite a bit taller, they're growing into the branch that's right above it. That happens all the time, and I trim a lot of those, but not too crazy, because on a really young tree, these, even though they're tiny, these little branches right here are the only potential of blossom and fruit set. So if you maybe wanted to get a couple peaches or apples, that's going to be coming out of these little spots. Even though they look scrappy, you don't want to just clean up everything and make it perfect sticks, because then you won't have an opportunity to harvest. So I would, just thinking ahead, these 2 are going to be problems, so I would take those off. And, nothing really to that. So this is not a central leader tree, but you can see that this branch here and this branch here are pretty dominant. They're almost like trying to become central leaders again. So if I cut this one off altogether, say, you can see that this has an upward trajectory. It's just trying to go up and up and up. This will look like another central leader tree in no time, in 1 year. So what I like doing in this case on apples, pears, and peaches and things like that, you see all the new growth, a lot of it just wants to shoot straight up. It seems really aggressive, but depending on the canopy and how high you want your tree to be, I'll pick a nice outward buds or branching, and I'll actually take these off, just because unless you want it to be really tall, that'll be a a major central branch that is going up. That's going to be 20 feet up in the air in no time. So you're never going to like mess up your tree. You have a lot of options for, you could just cut anywhere and it'll push out new limbs, and then you can choose the limbs you want to keep out of that.
Leggy and heavy, so that one would be one you would prune down to that.
I would, yeah. I would say that this, it doesn't have a lot of little horizontal branching because it's just trying to push up and up and up, and now it's split at the top. If we want any of these to become nice branches and push out these little buds, then I would just pick a nice general height that's conducive with the other heights of your branches. This one, we don't have to do this, but I'm just gonna say that that's here. Just stay roughly the same general height, and we're just.
45?
I am. There's differing. That in general, that's gonna try to. It's harder for the. So if you cut the limb dead across, it's easier for it to split and just make a fork and go straight up. So a lot of the times I'll try to pick a bud that's facing roughly in the right direction, and I'll cut it at an angle right above it, and hopefully we're just hoping that guy's pushing out. We're just trying to open up the tree instead of going up and up and up. So
Use it to keep it all one height for the growth hormone when it pushes out in spring.
on the actual cut itself?
On the whole thing. I've heard that the growth hormone will go to the tallest piece first.
I have not read that, but in theory, looking at a lot of trees, I can see that you have all these the tips are the things that just go nuts. So try to really bring it back in and encourage growth in here. So that does sound to be true. So this tree was really a specimen. It really looked good coming out here already. But there's a couple cuts that will help it out. We increased the structural integrity of the branches. They're not too luggy by being really, really tall. We cleaned up the inside a little bit and brought the central leaders that wanted to, or make new central leaders, they were trying to go up. We brought them back down, and then these will become more dominant branching. You can see it's just going to be a nice open tree. Now, when these start growing, they're going to try to grow straight up, and that's where we keep favoring these outward facing branches right here and keep cutting so they keep going out in general, or it's just going to get tall, really tall, and you're going to have a hard time harvesting or spraying. Without a ladder, you don't want the tree to get too much taller than 8 feet. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
I didn't know what I was doing, so I messed up. But
Okay.
that's why I'm here today. But our son just bought a house in May.
Okay.
And so he was out of town last weekend, so we thought we'd help him out.
Yeah.
And we messed up. But anyway, I went and I cut all those little leaders off and just smoothed it out. But it's an old tree. Like it's probably, I don't know, 7, 8 years old. It's a mature tree. So it's got a lot of, little limbs on the top.
Right.
This is tree up. And any peaches this year doing that.
He should be fine. Honestly, if you cut all the tips off, there's other potential for budding and for fruit set. But if you think about the extremities of the tree, if you want to bring the tree down, the whole canopy down, we just clip everything off. Let's clip every end. Every single one of those clips is going to want to double or triple, split and go into 3. And then next year you're trimming 3 back. So more or less, I try to, instead of just cutting straight, I try to pick one that you do want to keep and cut above it. And if this splits, and it might, and puts off a new one that goes over here, I'll just cut that one again. And this one's a continuation of this branch, and this might grow a new little split. So it's a fork. 2 or 3 years in a row, and I'll just keep cutting it off because it's not, you know, because that split will be a fork, then I'll have another split on that end. It just gets crazy. So don't just trim extremities. Pick one that you want to keep, and then cut above it, and bring the canopy. You know, if you have to bring the canopy way back down to the trunk, then it's probably because there was a neglect period, and that's harder on the tree. So.
Now, what about this pear tree? Would you leave all those side little arms at the top?
I personally would lop the top of it off again, but I'm going to leave that up to Ed.
And what about those little?
These little guys are good. I mean, it's actually a really good thing that they're going out.
That many of them?
That's probably fine for now because we'll have options in the future.
But you said you cut it at like shoulder, right there where your hand is. You messed it up.
I would, and some people cut it way shorter, where you have like a really low, you can see it coming out of the ground almost. But hip height is pretty manageable. If you cut it too high up here, then that's where the canopy starts, and it kind of can get a little crazy because that's where your main. These are going to be your main 3 middle branches. Then these are the outside kind of supporting branches. That whatever height this is at will always be your center branches. So. Even though there aren't a bunch of twigs already in this zone, I would cut it maybe here, and then it'll encourage new growth out the side versus, hey, there's 2 or 3, so I have to cut it up here to get any branching. If you cut it down here, it'll branch for you.
So I have a couple of pear trees that I guess they're probably 2 years now. And when they were little, they were 2 years. And I have got, all the way down the bottom. Do I need to come up with certain, so much so that they're not laying on the ground when they do fruit, or?
That's gonna be a pretty specific problem to pears. Pears are, all they do is grow suckers straight up. And I've seen on some pear trees, a brand new bud grow a sucker over 10 feet, one shot. And it's just like, and it's paralleling the trunk. It's growing right here. And it just, if you think about, okay, I'll leave that for 3 years, then it's not doing you a whole lot of good. So I would trim a lot of those because all they do is shoot up through the canopy and then come out the top. And so I trim a lot of those off from the base because they just add to a cluster in the middle that you can't get in, you can't do a lot with, you know.
So they're growing like that little section in the middle right now. They're all coming out, but I guess they'll turn up this year maybe.
They'll try to turn up, and then we'll have to trim those again so they kick out again. Okay. At least for quite a while, you have to keep kicking them out, and then you can start letting them go up if you want.
But you'd go ahead and top that.
I would.
Yeah, because that's how my pear trees it's kind of bushed out about shoulder height and it looks really pretty, but then it's got dang 4 foot, just nothing.
15 of them all going up.
Yeah.
Really? Yeah.
Like he's got, I had a bunch down around the base, so you'd go ahead and trim the ones at the base and then top it.
I would. And on a really old pear tree, sometimes we had these super healthy suckers coming out of the base, but the top has gotten crazy and out of control. Sometimes I brought the whole trunk down on like a 6-inch tree, and then that's your new tree almost. Because that's unusual. That's mostly on pears, but they have one growth habit, and it is like a stick, like I don't know, long, leggy stick that just goes straight up.
My nectarine trees look more like bushes than they do trees. Everything I've got is about 2 years. It's 2 years old right now.
Are they?
And they started out just the little whip stick things. I mean, they've done really well. But I wasn't sure on the nectarine trees what to do on those.
I would go with a wine cup like shape. So if it has a dominant central trunk, just cut it out. And that's another thing to note, that you don't have to do wine cup, but you know, peach trees and peaches and apples and pears, no, peaches, apples, plums, nectarines, those things, they're lower, wider trees anyways. They just kind of grow out. Pears are really the problem. They're not problems, they're just tall. And so you're not wildly changing the growth habit. You're just, you're helping it out a little bit, but you're not completely changing the DNA of the tree to make it want to do this versus up. You're just helping it out by cutting it off sometimes in the middle and letting it start opening up. Makes it so much more manageable.
So,
Yes.
our son, he bought this house, and this older man, he's got some, but he's got a plum tree that is, the diameter is like about that big.
Wow.
So, the branches are touching the roof of the house. So, do we just cut it off and get on the ladder as far as we can?
In general, that would be a good application for the paint. In general, I wouldn't cut the extremities. So say if this limb was over here touching something you don't want, I wouldn't hedge it. I would actually cut off the whole limb, the entire limb. Or, this is a good example, hey, from here out, it's all going on in the wrong direction. So I'll cut it here, because this is unlikely to turn and go towards the house. So, in general, don't ever hedge a tree to get it, to bring it in. If all this whole limb is going in the wrong direction, go back to the bud that you like the direction it is growing and cut it right there. So, and I like this one, for instance, because and I will cut the entire limb off to right there instead of, you know, here's the house and it's scraping. I'll cut it right here, because then you'll have 5 sticks scraping the next year, and it'll do that over and over and over. It just keeps splitting and getting crazy at the end.
So we have pear trees, but our house was built in 2008.
Okay.
The guy that built it he planted a peach orchard, but then there's pears and apples and other peaches. But the pear trees have shot so far up, like you were saying. Last year, during the freeze, actually the top of one of them is broken. And we've got branches hanging. So it's okay if we go get those pear trees and we just top them off basically at the middle.
To some
Because they're like way...
Yeah, to some extent, I would pick, if you have any branches that kick out, I would cut in a way that you can keep those.
Okay. We don't want anything as tall as him, though, right?
On a pear, it's almost inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to be 15, 20, but instead of being, you can kind of keep it there versus being 30 feet tall or more.
But we
you know.
can, because like I said, we've got things that just broke.
Right. Oh, for sure.
So we can top it like at least below that.
Definitely.
Okay.
Oh, for sure. Okay. So that's the thing. If you want to come down on the trunk, you know, say there's a bunch of stuff broken up here. If you want to come down to where there's nice outward branching down here, just cut it. It'll heal.
But paint it probably.
That would be a good candidate. If it's a 3-inch or 2-inch cut and it's facing up so everything just rests and sits right there, and bird poop and rain, that would be a great spot to cut it. So that's the most susceptible. If it's on an end, it's less of a problem, you know. Plums do stay lower.
So just let it.
Do you want it like are you saying like this tall?
Well, it's in a pot, it's in a raised garden, so this part right here is at like 3.5 feet.
Okay.
And then your limbs come out, so you're 4.5 feet before the limbs push, and then
It's like a
bushes.
tree.
So it's almost like a
But
like a boxwood or something?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
but it's only
I just don't know which
2 or
ones
3
to
years
cut
old.
and which ones to keep.
I would just, does it have a central leader?
Yeah.
Okay. I would probably take it out and
Take it down.
yeah, and just keep your outside branches
And like
before blooming. You could do it this year.
Yeah.
You could do it this year for sure. It's not too late. Anytime while they're still dormant. Now, if it's in full bloom right now, I wouldn't touch it. But
you're gonna have all your buds. It's not blooming yet.
right, it's not too late to prune. It's getting there. Give it 2 more weeks.
I had a question on that. If I'm buying fruit trees and planning on putting them in the ground like right now,
Yeah.
should I try to prune them? Or should I just let them grow this year and worry more about pruning them?
You could prune them. You might not see as aggressive of growth this spring, but just go ahead and get it over with. You'll save an entire year, and having to do that next year, and then it's like, man, they're a stick.
But if we're gonna prune, we need to get it done like within the next week on all our trees or so.
I'll do it the next week.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think this is our last cool front, probably.
Yeah, I just planted some pear trees.
But it's
like bottom here, and going straight through with 2 up. Should I just cut the middle one, or cut it?
How high is the fork?
Probably, I'll say probably right in here.
Okay.
And then, you got single one and 2 in one.
What I would probably at that point, since it has fork, is come up a foot or so, cut the forks now. And when those grow, they might split into 2. Then you pick the ones that are facing out the most.
Cut the ones that are out.
Above. And so say the fork is here, I'll cut above the fork at least a foot.
I'm making sure I know it. Leave the central part and just cut the ones that are forked off.
Oh, so are you saying it has a central leader?
It has a central leader.
Oh,
It has
okay.
2 coming off of it.
Okay. I would cut the central leader out.
Right at the door?
Yeah, exactly. I would cut the middle out, leave these 2. And how tall are the forks? You might just trim the ends of them off. Just come out here, and if it's 2 feet, maybe trim them 6 inches off, and maybe you'll go ahead and you'll get a split already this year. So, all right, guys. That's pretty much it.
Thank you very much.
Thank y'all. Sure appreciate it. Thank you. Good hanging out with y'all.